De ella viene la revolución, para que se asustan será para mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito, nada.
Morir como nací, sabedlo, puro, sencillo y optimista, de pie sobre la tierra como un árbol, en las filas del Partido Comunista, en las filas del Partido Comunista. Abrí sobre el altar de mi ventana y me sentí un diestro paisajista. Oh, qué bello es pintar para la vida, pintar para el Partido Comunista, pintar para el Partido Comunista. Aquel que amasa sangre entre las nubes, el criminal, el sádico, el guerrista, será aplastado en el mañana limpio por el limpio Partido Comunista, por el limpio Partido Comunista. Yo quiero que mi sangre fluya fácil, siempre ya la primera vista. Yo no puedo equivocarme, compañeros, mi amor es del Partido Comunista, mi amor es del Partido Comunista. Puedo morir como nací, sabedlo, puro, sencillo y optimista, de pie sobre la tierra como un árbol, en las filas del Partido Comunista, en las filas del Partido Comunista.
El canción al Partido Comunista, the song for the Communist Party. Long live the Communist Party of China. Long live the revolutionary peoples of China against capitalism, against imperialism. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 62, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Today, Sinophobia and Anti-Communism, exposing the relationship between xenophobia and anti-communism. We're going to discuss the historical roots of racism against Chinese peoples all over the world, in China and in the diaspora. And we're also going to talk about how opposition to Chinese socialism is often coded in bigoted racist language against Chinese peoples themselves, some of the stereotypes, some of the chauvinism, especially in particular from the Western left, from the liberal left in the US. And we're going to talk about some of the rampant xenophobia as well in Hong Kong's so-called independence movement, and also from groups like the Falun Gong, who have that show, that ballet show that everybody has probably heard of, that is touring and all over the North America. So we're going to talk about that. And joining us today is a comrade, a compañera, who's actually a longtime watcher and fellow traveler, Helen Chow Ying, who also known as Guantanamera, after the beautiful Cuban revolutionary song Guantanamera, a socialist Chinese historian based in Canada, Turtle Island. Helen is the co-founder and communications rep of Mother Nature's Acres, a grassroots co-op building a network for traditional food and medicine production. You can follow Helen on social media and on YouTube, following Guantanamera, like the song, Guajira Guantanamera. How's it going, Comrade Helen?
Thank you for the introduction and banging music as usual. Do you have any like a playlist of literally these revolutionary?
I don't have a playlist yet. I want to set one up. There's one comrade Deborah, who said she also wanted to start it up. So maybe we can do it. I would love to start some sort of revolutionary music playlist, because there's so many songs that we have to preserve within our culture and history as communists, as revolutionaries, and I'd love to start that out. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into the topic?
Okay, I guess first, I am an overseas Chinese with socialist characteristics. That is obviously a joke, the current name for China. And I do a variety of things, but my background that I was born in China. I was born in Hubei, and I grew up in Shanghai because my parents were both chemical engineers in Shanghai. And I moved to BC in Canada when I was about 13. And I've lived in Canada, and everyone that I grew up with was a communist or had been a communist at some point in their life. So it was not something I thought about until very recently, because it was not something I thought about. There were much that people discussed that I just took for granted. But yes, it was a very sort of communist upbringing. It's like applied communism. Like I wrote to you in the letter, my grandparents, who both my maternal and paternal grandparents, they were both semi-illiterate. Semi-illiterate peasants, but they were communists from roughly from the beginning, from 1945, because they said there was no food, there was no hope until communists came. So that's I don't know if that's much of an introduction, but that's maybe where I come from.
That's beautiful to hear, inspiring. When I went to China myself, there were a lot of families who had multi-generations of experiencing the transformation from feudalism and capitalism, the grandparents who were illiterate and were farming, to having grandkids and great-grandkids who are already working on space travel and scientists, and seeing how fast the development of China has taken place is something beautiful. And it's really what communism is about, is lifting people out of poverty, development, and bringing people together. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening, by the way. Shout out to Comrade Jenny Lin. Also, shout out to Dr. Jared Ball. Peace be peace. Big fan of Jared Ball's show on Black Power Media. Please subscribe to Black Power Media. Excellent channel. And Dr. Jared Ball has a great show. I'm actually Want to get in touch with you soon, Dr. Jared Ball, to have you on. I'd love to discuss a lot of topics with you. Shout out to Camel Spider Attack. Shout out to Ill State Fishing, to everybody who's watching and listening. And one of the reasons why I wanted to get into this topic is because recently there has been this commercial. I'm sure y'all have seen it. It's a really crappy and really corny commercial for a play and a performance that has been taking place for many years, Shen Yun. But here's the thing: it's not that the dancing or the culture itself is the bad part. The bad part is the political message behind it. So Shen Yun is basically this ballet, classical Chinese ballet performance that's organized by this cult called the Falun Gong. They're extremely anti-communist, very far right. Very into mysticism and very into a lot of weird stuff. So I want to play a clip of a commercial, and their whole thing is China before communism, right? And a lot of it is kind of playing into, even though many of the people themselves are Chinese, they're sort of playing into a lot of these stereotypes about China and communism. So I want to play this, and we can start the discussion that way.
Before communism, China had a glorious past. What if you could bring it back? Since 2006, Shen Yun has been reviving the essence of Chinese civilization, deeply rooted in ancient values like compassion, honesty, and faith. Yet decades of destruction, deceit, and violence have nearly destroyed a nation's values, along with its own identity. So how do you revive what has been lost in today's China?
I think it's important to mention that what has been lost in today's China is a lot of reactionary cultures. And when we talk about the Chinese Revolution, right, 1949, the communists liberated China from reactionary politics, from imperialism. A lot of the things that the Chinese people were revolting against were feudalism. If we talk about Tibet, the destruction against the Dalai Lama system, Dalai Lamas in Tibet had a very horrible system where women weren't even allowed to go to school to get educated. Women were forced into sex slavery. So a lot of horrible things. But I don't know if you want to react to that Shen Yun commercial, Helen, and your thoughts on that.
Thanks for showing that. It's the first time I see a long clip of Shen Yun, because I usually, whenever I see it on Facebook, I just like skip, because it is so. It's like a nice song played backwards. It has like, you sort of see them. I don't know how to say this. It's as if they are acting as white people in Chinese costumes. This is how I feel as a Chinese person watching them, because it's like a white ballet, but with all the, and then knowing that they are paid by the State Department and, the George Soros cartel people. And it's totally cringe. What was I about to say? You mentioned feudalism earlier, about the revolt. I wanted to say something about the Great Leap Forward and also the subsequent Cultural Revolution of 1967 to 1976, because I hear people say this often, to either attribute this to the leadership or literally to Mao, one person, or to a sort of like general backwardness of the Chinese people in that they cannot make peace. But from my point of view, this, especially the Cultural Revolution, the stuff that happened in destroying or in sort of cutting off ties to a certain kind of tradition. And yes, there were certain instances where this got out of hand, but it was not really something that could be attributable to any one person. It is just simply because at that point in time in Chinese history context, that the will to change to move forward into a modern time and to be China in the 21st century and the 20th century, I guess. And also the urge to, or that need or that feeling of I have to keep my culture because I actually love my culture. Those two things were getting to a point of not being able to coexist. So for me, that's actually why the things happened. It was not one single person saying like, oh, you guys should all do this. But people have to know that the context for a lot of those breaking down the temples and breaking down the idols were because there were people in the 50s, 60s who were abusing those things, who were using those idols and temples and institutions as further either a kind of revisionism or total anti-revolution. So it was very dangerous either way. If it didn't happen, it might have been the case that the revolution itself would have been snuffed. So it's not so simple, I think. Anyway, that's
most definitely.
What I want to say.
No, beautifully said. And I think it's important to mention that because a lot of times people act as if China has been a superpower on an equal footing as the US forever. And people forget that during the 1800s, what they call the century of humiliation, China was subjected to the 2 opium wars by the Western imperialist powers. They were forced to consume drugs. They were colonized. They were completely exploited and marginalized by the imperialist system. And in many ways, it continues today. And I think it's important to give that context because also a lot of the fears of, especially from the white Western imperialist countries, of a strong and united China, those have been taking place since the 1800s. And what I want to do is I want to share a few images really depicting that and bringing that home, because this fear of China, this brainwashing and propaganda from the West that China is this evil empire that's going to take over and they're animals and they're a hive mind. That's sort of the stereotype, right? That they can't think for themselves. They're just like ants that are becoming this huge empire. That idiocy has been prevalent since the 1800s. And so there's this first cartoon that I want to share. This is a cartoon from 1869 called Pacific Chivalry. Encouragement to Chinese immigration. So basically at this time, this is a cartoon by Thomas Nast depicting the way that white people in the US view Chinese immigrants in the 1800s. Mind you, this is after the 2 opium wars. This is at the height of the crisis in China, when China was completely obliterated by imperialism and Chinese people were forced to move to where I'm speaking to you from now, which is quote unquote California. And so a lot of Chinese workers were forced to move to California, work on the railroads, because you had westward expansion, you have the gold rush. And so at this cartoon, 1869, it basically depicts the racism of white people against Chinese migrants. But keep in mind that this was not from a point of view of like trying to expose the racism. It was encouraging it, basically. Look, even in the bottom, encouragement to Chinese immigration. So this is the message that a lot of the white settlers in California had of Chinese migrants who were just trying to survive and get by. So that's one image. And another image that I want to share is this one, which is 1881. This one is called The Coming Man, a cartoon from 1881, published in the San Francisco Wasp, a newspaper, approximately 1 year before the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it depicts, for those of you who are listening, a Chinese man depicted in the traditional garb, which was popular at the time, the long ponytail with the hat. And on his hand, it says Monopoly, and his hand looks like sort of reptilian in a way. He's depicted in a very childlike and demeaning manner, but he's still this kind of like evil demonic force. And Dr. Jarabald asked, did he say the San Francisco Wasp? Yeah, it was literally called the San Francisco Wasp. So they weren't even holding back. They were straight up about it. They were like, yo, we are the Wasps and we hate China. And so this is a cartoon. Like, this is really The Coming Man. And so mind you, right, this image basically appealed to the U.S. fears of a Chinese, quote, takeover of American society and enterprise. Even though the Chinese only occupied less than 1% of the population, they continued to reinforce this idea that China was going to sort of take over and become the new dominant power. And it's something that is really disgusting to see, because it's something that continues today, where they're showing his hand with monopoly. They're saying China's going to take over the rising dragon, the rising empire. That's one of the images as well that tends to be popularized, the dragon. So that's from 1881, right? And so basically, the following years, you had what was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically excluded Chinese immigrants from being able to move to the U.S. and work. It was the first and only in the U.S. overtly racist and discriminatory act against immigrants from a specific country. And you had this sorry, that's for later on. You had this one from 1886, Chinese Exclusion Act cartoon from the George D. Magic Washing Machine Company. So there was a washing machine company called George D. Magic, and basically this washing machine company released this political cartoon saying that your clothes will get as clean as the U.S. is being cleansed of Chinese immigrants, coinciding with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it basically was intended to promote the company's new washing machine materials. So you have, for those of you listening, again, another Chinese person with the long hair being kicked out, having the same kind of reptilian or animal-looking face and hands, being kicked out by Uncle Sam, who's holding a proclamation. And you see other Chinese folks in the bottom left corner who seem to be heading toward the Pacific Ocean, back to China. Again, most of this is happening where I'm speaking to you from now, California, aka Chumash land, settled Chumash land, indigenous land. And so this is where the oldest Chinese community actually existed in the U.S. And this is the stuff that was going on here. So this stuff about, China taking over and being evil, and they're these collectivist hive mind creatures, this goes back to the 1800s. This is not new. So I was wondering, Helen, if you have any thoughts about that, and maybe if you want to talk about that, how that makes you feel,
I have a really good book to recommend to everybody. It's actually from an American scholar, Jonathan Spence. He's a Yale sinologist. He's passed away now, and has a great bibliography. But this one that I particularly want to recommend people is called The Chan, or the Khan, I guess. But The Chan of the Great Continent, China in the Western Mind. He traces this writing about Chinese people from the Western perspective all the way to the Venetians, all the way to the Portuguese from about 1400s, where you started to have a lot of people who, because of the Mongol situation, that going to China was easier for the Europeans. Yes, exactly, that book. There were a lot of travelers who did not actually make it all the way into China. At most, they might have gone close to what is modern day between Inner Mongolia and Beijing. And there's a few things. One is sometimes they would literally make shit up because, so-and-so is paid by the Jesuit order to write a certain report, but he didn't actually get into the country. So what he would do is look at what other people have written before, and based on what he has seen as what he thinks is Chinese, come up with a travelogue story. And this went on for hundreds of years. And it got worse and worse and worse, of Europeans talking about China from, it's essentially not China. It's essentially like their idea of China. It's like basically they're talking to themselves. It's like I don't really know China, but I think China is like this. And then I'm going to say it's bad because I am... The guy who wrote Robinson Crusoe, for example, was a very... Actually, he said, I wrote that book specifically because of my hatred of China. Because I wanted to go away by myself. This idea of sort of... It's a twisted thing. It's like, in a way, you can see that in this case, the white superiority, or the European superiority, or the even is actually a European inferiority, because it's a compensation. It's an overcompensation for not actually being able to make a Chinese friend, because there were other Europeans who did make it. There was a very famous Italian called Matteo Rizzi. He was one of the first, he was the one who actually translated the Bible into Chinese. But if you actually look at his bibliography and his life, the Bible was one of it was like a minor work for him. He actually, his major work was he spent about 40 years with the Ming emperor and some of the court literatis, and he translated a lot of Chinese classics into Italian. He was the first to start this kind of stuff. So yeah, there were successes, but people like that did not write about China in, it's sort of the Jonathan Spence, people should go read that book more than just I can explain. It's a very, very good book. But yes, this is, it from the 15th century, 15th, 16th century, it gets more and more comprehensive in this sort of fictionalization of China. By the time you get to the Fu Manchu series, by the time you get to Pearl Buck, who was one of the best-selling novelists in America in the 19th century or the 20th century, it gets to... It's even hard to talk about this sometimes. When I think about it, it's just so incredible that could be the case, because this actually goes with something that is happening currently, because I've heard people online say, why should we not like China? I bet they don't like us in China. But this is the point. I grew up in China. Chinese people do not make TV shows to make fun of anybody.
Right.
This is a very specifically thing we don't like. We could make, there's Chinese TV shows about Africans, about Europeans, about even the Korean War. I watched the Battle of Changjing Lake about the Korean War. They used all American actors and great CGI. It was good. But like basically that's not true. China does not like anybody. And in particular, a giant country that we trade all the time, that we have people going back and forth for thousands of years. Why? Why would you hate people? Why would you create that context for yourself? That's how I feel, I guess. But
yeah,
it's easier to make rumors than to how you say, to dispel it. But ultimately, I think all this is a way to distract people here. They, in a way, know that they cannot really hurt China, but they can divide and conquer people here. Like there's a saying we say in Chinese, 鷸蚌相争，渔翁得利. If the crane and the shellfish fight each other, the fisherman is going to win. This is the situation they are setting up for us. You see, there's people waiting. The Raytheon, the Lockheed Martin, and they need to make money. Last year, they lost, I was hearing something like 100 billion in expected sales. But what does that mean, expected sales? It means expected murder, expected carpet bombing, expected drone strikes. But anyway, that's kind of our situation.
Speaking about that, I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of times the Western imperialist forces, they'll point to folks who are of Chinese origin themselves, and they'll say, look, we got to go help them. And this is an image from 2019, the quote-unquote Hong Kong democracy protest. This is in Hong Kong. This is not a Proud Boys rally. This is not a U.S. Unite the Right rally. This is in Hong Kong. These are Chinese folks in Hong Kong that have a banner that says, President Trump, please liberate Hong Kong. And they have US flags. And this is around the same time that you have people burning the Chinese flag, saying that we are British, we are not Chinese, and clearly very Chinese. What is your conversation? Have you had encounters with Chinese folks who are like this, who have this colonized mentality where they identify, it's like Stockholm syndrome in a way, right? Where they're identifying with the people who oppressed them historically, and they're like, please save us from China. And it's like, you know, and it's just crazy to me. So I don't know, have you had any sort of encounters like this before?
Definitely, there's people in my own family.
Yeah, I could imagine. Yeah, for sure.
There's people there's people in the diaspora. I would have to say, unfortunately, the Chinese diaspora in the West, in Canada, in the States, are not particularly the communist type. They are much more of the Epoch Times, Falun Gong kind of. Not to kind of put a blanket thing, but there is much more, you know, because we live in the imperial core. It's almost like not specifically like to blame those Chinese people, because if they were living in, I don't know, a diaspora in North Korea, for example, they might not have that kind of environment. But here, there's very much a kind of, yeah, I would say it's an ultra capitalist push for diaspora children to be like the next Hillary Clinton. I have literally had to deal with this. Like, you know, people are like, I work for Hillary Clinton in summer, and I had to go out and puke. And like, it was just, oh, but yes, this guy. And if you look at a lot of the, you know, if you go to entertainment industries, if you study that kind of thing in Korea, in China, in Taiwan, for example, it's all American capital, or not American per se, but capital. So it's like people are soaked in that. It's like they grow up, you're supposed to, yeah, it's like, it's what I meant. It's like an ultra kind of capitalism. Like, and so, yes, I would actually, I don't know. I've not really studied about the Chinese communist or communism movement in Canada or the States, because I actually doubted there was ever one, because of what I said, because of this context.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know. I actually, for my time in Canada, I've kind of made a point to spend more with local people, with native people, with you know, the people who were here before, because a lot of my people are very confused. They're very I will not say this for everyone, but there is a, you know, it's not. For example, there's some people I heard online who said, we have to study Alibaba, we have to study Ma Yun, because that billionaire is what we have to study to be communist. Like the basic logic confusion. Like, no, it's backwards. It's like, why are you studying? Anyway, it's not to say that learning how to run a business is not a bad thing, but it's much more important, if you're going to be a communist, to study how to curtail those things, how to, you know, prevent capital from directing culture.
Mm-hmm. No, most definitely. And I think it's interesting that, I think it's really cool and fascinating that you tend to organize and work alongside more Indigenous First Nations peoples in quote unquote Canada, because embedded into a lot of Indigenous cultures are critiques of capitalism, and seeing how capitalism destroyed so many Indigenous communities, and how capitalism and individualism is antithetical to Indigenous culture. And also what I find interesting is how in a lot of the talk about COVID-19, you know, and also the Stop Asian Hate in the US, that was a big thing. I don't know about Canada, but in the US, there was a lot of stuff, Stop Asian Hate, Stop Asian Hate. But none of it was in any way directed against the people who were spouting anti-China propaganda, especially anti-communist Chinese propaganda, because that's convenient. This seems to be the one thing that liberals and conservatives unite around, is bashing China, bashing the Communist Party. And so I want to play a clip. This is from an Epoch Times documentary. Again, Epoch Times is a publication that is run and managed by this crazy cult called the Falun Gong, supported by the National Endowment for Democracy, supported by the U.S. imperialist class, and that has engaged in some really crazy stuff. This is a clip from a documentary about China and COVID, essentially blaming the Chinese people and communism for creating COVID. So I'm going to play this, and then we'll talk a little bit about that.
I watch CNN, I watch Fox, I watch CBS, and in this case, there's a lot of things not being said.
This is just the essential nature of Chinese communism. Chinese communism is evil.
Every person it harms is directly attributable to the Chinese Communist Party.
The Central Party is the thing which they want to protect, their power, and people and nation issues are secondary to the continuation of power.
Communist Party is malign and it is grossly irresponsible. It has pressured governments to keep their borders open, and it had to know that that would result in the fast spread of coronavirus to other countries. This is the worst sort of behavior, and the world's got to understand that there will not be peace, there will not be good order and stability in the world as long as the Communist Party rules China.
The Wall Street Journal writes a piece as China is a sick man of Asia. It needs to be corrected. It's not China is a sick man of Asia. It is the Communist Chinese Party that's a sick man of Asia.
The Communist Party has policies that people abhor. And it's not just its reaction to the coronavirus. We see this with the suppression of rights, also with holding perhaps 1 million people, maybe even 3 million people in concentration camps. So this is just the essential nature of Chinese communism. Chinese communism is evil.
While China pretends to be a responsible member of the international community, in reality, they are doing much to undermine the rule of law and human rights. We at the Epoch Times refer to the Wuhan coronavirus, or COVID-19, as the CCP virus, because the Chinese Communist Party's cover-up and mishandling allowed the virus to spread throughout China and create a global pandemic.
First of all, how the fuck logistically do you manage 3 million people in concentration camps allegedly? How do logistically, where are the images for that? Where's the proof for that, right? Just completely thrown. 3 million, by the way. I live in Los Angeles. The city of LA is about 3 million people. That's a lot of fucking people. Where the fuck are all the, like, it just logistically, it doesn't make sense. They throw out these numbers because people think, oh, there's like 2 billion Chinese people, so 3 million is like nothing. And so that's one thing. The other thing, he just is flat out saying Chinese communism is evil and using these terms that we're seeing again from these images from the 1800s depicting Chinese folks as these demons, as these demonic entities that are hinged on world domination. And I think even the music, just the music that they play, makes you feel intense. It makes it feel like some monsters coming after you. And that's the way, we've covered this in previous episodes, how mind control and propaganda works, where they play this music to create a sense of anxiety where you're like, and you're just like, oh my God, like what's coming up next? It's Xi Jinping, and it's crazy, man. I don't know. It's just insane. But your analysis and reaction to this, Comrade Heller.
I saw a comment, actually it was very heartwarming. It was from an American lady. She commented on one of the, about the Uyghur concentration camp thing. She said, I did the math. To house all these people with the proper, you would need something like 2,000 football fields. And that picture is way too small. I really like that comment. It's this. It's like, if they need satellite images to start fabricating, because remember the Bay of Pigs? The satellite image is such a, I don't know, it's like a cheap Pentagon thing. If they had anything for real, like shout out to Silver Spook, a Hawaiian comrade who talks about this all the time. He said, I heard about the Uyghur genocide and I checked. He said, then I got very offended because I am Hawaiian, native Hawaiian. You don't need a satellite image to know that native Hawaiians is undergoing cultural and physical genocide right now. Children are not allowed to speak Hawaiian right now at school. You don't need a satellite image for this.
Right.
It's like just it's common sense stuff. But since we're dealing with propaganda, and I really like that episode you did on music and propaganda because it's so important to talk about this.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's music is the one of the classic ways, especially against China and DPRK in particular. They always use the scary horror film music to scare the crap out of you. And so shout out to Jenny Lin, by the way. Jenny Lin said, the monster's coming to lift you out of poverty, you know? So it's that's something that with China, they always portray China as this evil tyrant, this evil dragon taking over the world. And Epoch Times is notorious for that in particular. I also want to play this other clip. This is from China Uncensored. I don't know if y'all have heard of them. They're also another Falun Gong link channel. Millions of views, millions of subscribers. If you look up videos about China, they're one of the first channels that come up. And they're claiming, this is another one of the crazy ones, that China is, and the Communist Party is organ harvesting. That they're literally kidnapping people and stealing their organs. You know, and you think about scary movies, right? What kind of creature does that? Like a monster does that, right? Organ harvesting. Again, they're playing into these stereotypes that we've seen going back to the 1800s. So I'm going to play this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this whole organ harvesting nonsense.
The Chinese Communist Party doesn't like the success of any Korean drama in China. But Squid Game is different, because it touches on one of China's most closely guarded secrets: forced organ harvesting. Minor spoilers for Squid Game. Sorry I can't actually show you the scene because YouTube would freak out if I did. So there's a side plot where some people running the show harvest the organs of players that are killed, and they sell the organs to Chinese buyers. The writers of Squid Game knew what they were talking about, because China does in fact kill prisoners of conscience to harvest their organs. Some of the more than 1.5 million detainees in Chinese prison camps are being killed for their organs to serve a booming transplant trade that is worth some $1 billion a year. That was the finding of the China Tribunal in 2019. It was an independent people's tribunal led by Sir Jeffrey Nice, the same guy who prosecuted former dictator of Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic, at the International Criminal Court. And when the tribunal says these are people in prison camps, they're not talking about people who are in prison for committing crimes. They're talking about people who are in prison for their religious beliefs or their ethnicity. The primary victims are Falun Gong practitioners. Falun Gong is a Chinese spiritual practice the Communist Party has been persecuting since 1999. More recently, ethnic Uyghurs are becoming a major source of organs. Tibetans and house Christians have also been victims of China's organ harvesting. Now, to be clear, when you hear organ harvesting, we're talking about people who are killed specifically for their organs. And it's not some back alley black market thing. It's being done in state-run hospitals sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party. You see, in most of the world, to get an organ, you need to be put on a waiting list that can take years, because you're essentially waiting for a compatible person to die naturally or from an accident. In China, you can schedule a transplant. That is not possible unless you're scheduling someone to die. Organs have a very short shelf life, sometimes just a few hours. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party is covering this up. Just a week before the Netflix hit Squid Game was released, Beijing furiously denied the existence of a state-sponsored organ harvesting program.
So crazy stuff. This guy, at first when I watched this, I thought it was like a skit. Like I thought it was like Comedy Central or something, and I was like, what the fuck? And then I look at the channel, and they're trying to like legit be serious about it. They're trying to legit be like, oh yeah, this is legitimate evidence. And by the way, this is like the guy Jeffrey Nice. This is the fucking goblin demon that's in charge of determining whether all these things are true or not. This guy has been involved in a lot of human rights violations in Yugoslavia, in particular against Milosevic, and in the 90s when the U.S. bombed the crap out of Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, based on false evidence. And this guy has been implicit in a lot of fake operations and a lot of psychological operations, false flag attacks by the empire. Jeffrey Nice, this is the piece of shit who's in charge of this tribunal on organ harvesting. So I really don't believe much of what this guy is saying. But I don't know, Comrade Helen, if you have any thoughts or reaction to the whole organ harvesting claim.
I noticed the thing. Oh yes, I'm muted. I don't know if you guys noticed. They didn't say that every single Chinese person is under threat of being organ harvested. They said specifically 3 groups: Uyghurs, Tibetans, and for whatever reason, Han Christians. This is specific propaganda, right? This is trying to say they are not just harvesting organs, they're harvesting white people organs. Which first of all, I don't know how the Tibetans would feel being called white people, and also Uyghurs, but it's this concept like they're coming for your special white organs because you're so special. Like your sacred organs are what they are after. This kind of speech, because it's kind of repeated with the Adrian Zentz, the speech. I'm not sure what to call it, like fiction, not very good fiction. It has that tone all over it, that they are going to be leading a white genocide. Like they're working with other people is setting up for allies for a worldwide white genocide, and they're going to harvest all of your organs after they're done with the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and the Christians. For some reason, what does that have to do with the Christians? Oh yes, because white Christians, they're trying to appeal to. It's a bit like the cotton thing. Remember, they said, cotton and slavery, because in American mind you have this cotton industry in the Americas was always a slave operation. So it's very normal for people to, reminded of this, to say, it's only slaves. Yeah, I'm not sure what to say. Sometimes I feel like, wow, you guys really don't know anything. But sometimes I feel like it's more simple than that. It's like they don't want to know. Because if you want to know, and actually what you've shown today is I think you actually know more about me than more than me than a lot of this stuff, because you're studying it. It's not that hard to study. The material is all there. But I think because they want to make war on China, they have to stay on the racist thing because it's required, right? They have to not be able to see people as people.
Yeah, the dehumanization. And even there's this comedian, Bill Maher. So you know about the Olympics, Eileen Gu, who is of Chinese origin, but was raised in the U.S. but has decided to represent China, which I think is awesome, which I think is badass. And I'm glad. Shout out, by the way, one of my comrades, Carl Za, has a great podcast, Silk and Steel podcast. And one of the best episodes on Carl's awesome. Yeah, Carl's great. One of his best episodes was on Chinese diaspora folks moving back to China and how more Chinese folks are moving back, and obviously there's more opportunity and growth there. Eileen Gu is somebody who is part of that, right? Part of that generation. So I want to play a little bit of this clip from Bill Maher's show Real Time, where he's basically trying to humorize China. Bill Maher blasts Olympic skier Eileen Gu for representing totalitarian China on Real Time. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this, and then we'll talk about that.
And finally, new rule: someone has to tell China, you can steal our trade secrets, our software, and our intellectual property, but we draw the line at our hot freestyle skiers. Now, if you've been like me over the past few weeks, glued to your TV watching the Olympics, that makes exactly 2 of it. Who knew there were shithole countries, but who knew there was a shithole superpower? But I'm sure you've heard about American citizen Eileen Gu, the beautiful model, influencer, and now gold medal winning skier who was born and raised here in America, but who chose to ski in the Olympics for China. Cool, huh? Is it? Is that cool now? To choose to represent a totalitarian police state over America? The Olympics pretends to only be about sports, but of course the games have always been a bit of a proxy war for which country has the best system. And by choosing Team China, Eileen Gu became a living symbol of China's triumph over the West, which wouldn't bother me so much if I thought China had triumphed over us in the ways that really matter, but they haven't. Now, we do have human rights issues right here at home, we do, but we're still, at least for another 3 years, a democracy based on freedom. And they are an authoritarian surveillance state based on how'd you like to disappear for a few minutes?
Oh my God. Fucking idiot, man.
A tennis player who recently vanished for a while when she said she'd been raped by a government official.
No, she didn't.
Right, yeah.
Many black people in jail.
She's not missing.
Matters.
Right.
China has basically jailed an entire ethnic minority, the Uyghurs, a situation that both the Trump and Biden administrations has called a genocide. America is not close to that. And it's a cynical dodge to pretend that China's sins should be overlooked because we all do it. No. In 1997, Britain returned Hong Kong to China with an agreement that from Beijing, that Hong Kong could retain its free press, honest courts, and democratic government. Well, they lied.
Which they did not have in British time.
Being crushed there,
Right.
and China doesn't
Keep
want anyone
what?
to talk about it. And because so much money is involved, no one does. 2 years ago, when the general manager of the Houston Rockets, Daryl Morey, tweeted, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong," he was forced to apologize. In America, we're supposed to root for democratic government, not apologize for it. But the NBA has a television deal with China worth $1.5 billion. So LeBron James said Morey needed to be educated on the situation. I got some shoes to sell.
Oh my God.
LeBron.
So this is more of it, I'm not going to go into it, but Bill Maher again, and I feel like part of it's part of like programming, right? Something we talked about in previous episodes is consent. So when you have a laugh track, and this is part of mind control, even Edward Bernays talks about this, is that when you have a laugh track, you're programming people to believe something is funny, even though it's not. And a lot of times this has happened in, especially in Latin American media, whenever you have depictions of LGBTQ people, if somebody is trans or if you have a man or a quote unquote man dressed as a woman, immediately the laugh track comes on to program you to think like, oh, that's bad, like ha ha ha. So like they're doing that same thing with Bill Maher, where they're like, I've never seen a shithole superpower, and it's like, and it's just crazy. Like that's part of that psychological programming that they're doing to make you think that this is funny. And as somebody pointed on the chat, sexually objectifying Eileen Gu, the long history of white imperialist men having this fantasy about liberating these oppressed Asian women, which is a whole nother, psychotic fucking thing to talk about. And he's talking about how, we're a democracy based on freedom. And, what are your thoughts on these comedians and comedy and trying to weaponize this for anti-China propaganda?
It is very rampant these days. I never thought in my life I would actually hear those words from Tucker Carlson. Those were rather shocking. But then I realized I didn't know anything to be shocked. What do I say about this? I'm really glad for everyone who's here in the chat, who are obviously seeing through this already. I honestly, doing this episode today, it's like giving me confidence to start a real podcast on this, because I wanted to do this for a long time, but now I've seen people who like actually are, on the other side. So I have to be thanking you. And what do I say about this? The sexual objectification, or that it's very chauvinistic, right? Like, I hate Asian people. I hate China, but I love Asian women. And they say it like that.
Yep.
It's something that I learned this recently from Hawaiian comrade Silver's book. He said, you know how people say in South Korea was a economic miracle? It was so much greater than North because, the US made it rich or something. How though? How did they do that? 25% of South Korea primary accumulation in the 60s, 70s, and when they just start off, was from sexual slavery, sex industry. And it's not just in Korea, it's in Vietnam, Philippines, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, it's everywhere. And this is something that started off since Second World War, particularly because there were prostitution before, but what distinguishes them from this is that the US Army and also the Japanese Army under the US Army institutionalized this to the point where millions actually of these survivor women who are still trying to get justice cannot, because they were how do they say this? Basically, the court does not recognize that this was survival sex. It's like, it was commercial. It is commercial because that's how we built South Korea. And actually, this ties back to the Squid Game thing. Squid Game, from what I understand, I've not studied this enough, so if there's Korean comrades, please correct me. But from what I understand is Squid Game talks about each of the great massacres, or like the way that the South Korean people had been subjugated and literally massacred in different ways, and it's like coded in different ways. I've not studied enough to kind of know this, but when they say, how do they say? Like, actually, I forgot kind of my point. Like, yes, because there was that that Falun Gong guy who said those are things that are happening in like Squid Games. It's talking about China. No, Squid Games is about South Korea. It's about capitalist Asia. So it's backwards.
Yeah.
Backwards. Everything's backwards.
Most definitely. And I feel like in many ways, it's a reflection, a self-reflection of what capitalist society is really like. A lot of times with imperialist propaganda, they're just reflecting on what is actually happening within their own system and making it seem like it's the happenings of their enemy. This is another picture I saw online. This is from a group called Agitators for China Democracy. And these are right-wing Chinese folks holding up U.S. flags. Says CCP equals evil. We are anti-CCP. And again, this is something I just find this phenomena fascinating. It's also kind of like the right-wing Cubans in Miami who are like pro-US, who are all about bombing Cuba and invading. They're like, please liberate Cuba. The Venezuelans and the Nicaraguans. And in the US, this is a phenomena as well. Even with the Vietnamese, there are a lot of right-wing Vietnamese who use the yellow flag, the false colonizer flag of quote-unquote South Vietnam. And so these folks are very similar to that, and just in equating the CCP with evil. And I just find it interesting because these are the people who get weaponized by the imperialists and say, look, Chinese people are against the Communist Party, even though it's a minority. The Communist Party of China is the largest, not only the largest communist party in the world, but the largest political party with most members. And I think that's really fascinating, really interesting. So I think, what are your thoughts on that? Just kind of wrapping up.
Gusanos suck. Asian gusanos suck even more. Ophelia.
Ophelia just got back. Yeah, Asian. I like that term actually. Asian gusanos.
It's who they are. It's who they are. I have to say that I was really touched by that podcast you did with Ophelia on eating disorder. I watched that a few times. It was amazing. And anyway, that's kind of off topic.
Yeah, thank you. It was actually really fun doing that. And one of the things that kind of related to China that I think is really beautiful about the Chinese diet, when we went to China, so much of the food that is eaten in China is preserved as historical. And China has resisted a lot of the neoliberal food empires, McDonald's, Burger King. It exists, it's there, but it's not popular as the traditional Chinese food, like hot pot, and the authentic, healthier Chinese food is still dominant. I think it's beautiful that the Chinese people have been able to preserve that and maintain that, because if it were up to the imperialist corporations, they would have all these Burger King and McDonald's and Coca-Cola on every corner, and the Chinese people would forget all about their traditional food. And that's part of the war of imperialism. It's not just economic and political, it's cultural as well. And I think in many ways, the white Western imperialists are upset that the Chinese people are like, yeah, we see your McDonald's, we see your Burger King, we're good, we have our own shit, you know? And I think that's kind of part of the anger that they have as well.
That's very true. What did you really enjoy, like food-wise? Did you remember a dish?
I'm gonna have a hard time pronouncing the names, but I can tell you a lot of the foods in China that I really enjoyed. The beans, they were like the bean sprouts that had like the red chili flakes. I enjoyed the meat in China was very clean and very like it. In the U.S., a lot of the meat that we consume is pumped with hormones and poison and all this crazy stuff. And in China, I felt like it was just clean. People eat a lot of vegetables and meat. It was very healthy, I felt. I enjoyed a lot of the mushrooms in China. China has a lot of diversity of mushrooms. The flavor was amazing. The beef, the chicken. I also really liked one thing that I noticed that was really popular in China that I enjoyed a lot is Western Chinese food from Xinjiang, which is, interestingly enough, where a lot of the Uyghur community is, because they use a lot of cumin on the meat. So a lot of the meat that they have, like the lamb in particular and the beef, they'll have cumin on it. The kebabs, China's. I gotta tell you all, like, go to China if you ever get a chance. China is such a beautiful country to visit. And it's so affordable. I was amazed at how little I actually spent there, because you can get low cost and nutritional food for everywhere you go. Public transportation is amazing. The Beijing transit system is way more efficient than New York. I'm from New York, born and raised, and Beijing's train system was like clockwork. Every 5 minutes, a clean train was coming through. I went to Xinjiang, I went to Shanghai, I went to Beijing. There's still so much more of China that I have to see, but I really want to compel people to actually go there, especially a lot of the quote-unquote Western left who are critical of China, to really understand that you can only truly understand socialism with Chinese characteristics when you're in China and you see it for yourself and you talk to people and you see how it has lifted millions of people out of poverty. I think you experience it in such a different way than any of these ultra left YouTubers will ever try to explain it, you know?
Definitely. I that's actually one of the reasons I reached out to you, was that you guys actually went to China. And yes, I was there too in 2019. I was there. I came back right before COVID. I was in Shanghai. But I'm very jealous you went to Jinggangshan. I had never been. It's very cool.
Jinggangshan is beautiful. It's me and Ophelia were like, oh, it's like a communist Disney World, because it's basically like you have all these different just amazing sites, amazing historical sites of the Chinese Revolution. You have like the place where Mao started the Long March and the Red Army. And it was just something really, it was just such a beautiful experience. And I think people really have to go to China and see for themselves what it's like, because if you're just going by what mainstream media says, if you're just going by what the imperialist propaganda says, then you're going to be just totally misled about China. But Comrade Helen, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Any last comments you want to say before we head out?
No, I hope to return the favor soon. Maybe have you on my podcast for different interviews. This was great fun. Thanks for accepting my application.
Your application has been submitted. Thank you for filling out the form. Yeah, come through anytime. I appreciate it. It was great having you on. We spoke with Comrade Helen Chow Ying Hu, a socialist Chinese historian based in Canada, Turtle Island. Helen is the co-founder and communications rep of Mother Nature's Acres, a grassroots co-op building a network for traditional food and medicine production. You can follow Helen on social media using the handle Guantanamera, a beautiful song from the Cuban Revolutionary era. Helen is also very knowledgeable about revolutionary music and history, and I'm going to take up Helen's idea of starting some sort of revolutionary music playlist on Spotify or something. I think that'd be pretty cool to share with y'all. Thank you so much, everybody who's watching and listening to Dr. Jared
Thank
Ball,
you,
to
everyone in
Erica.
the chat. You guys' comments were amazing. Hope to see you guys soon, maybe on my channel. And thank you.
And then you can find Comrade Helen's channel. Just look up Guantanamera on YouTube. It's the one channel that isn't the song, so you'll see it. If anything, I'll put a link to it afterward.
That's true.
It's the one that's not the song. But thank you so much, Comrade Helen. I really appreciate having you on. Thank you to everybody for watching, listening. We're gonna go out to some music from the People's Republic of China. Peace, everybody. Take care.